Hi, I'm Alison and I'm going to tell you about what I think are 5 of the greatest trumpet concertos. I do hesitate to say the 5 greatest, as this isn't a sport and it is also pretty subjective, but these are really important in many ways. These 5 I hope will show you the various characters of the instrument, why it is so brilliant, and how the music written for it was very much dependent on the trumpet itself having the technical capabilities, as well as a player, of course, who was able to interpret the music and bring it alive. The golden age of the trumpet was definitely the Baroque era, and a great example of this is the Concerto by Georges Philippe Telemann. It shows the trumpet emerging as something not just for fanfares and heralding big occasions, but capable of subtlety, and if the player had stamina, to play in what was called the clarino register. This meant a very voice-like and expressive virtuosity in the upper register. A few trumpeters who could do this at the time were held in extremely high regard in the courts of Europe and treated as musical aristocracy. And if we're working through chronologically, we absolutely have to go to Haydn's masterful trumpet concerto, one of Haydn's greatest works in my opinion. This piece is just so perfectly formed, and it was also very pioneering at the time. It was written for the incredible trumpeter Anton Weidinger in the courts of the Esterházy Palace, and he had a trumpet that had keys like this, and it was the first time anyone had ever heard the trumpet playing low down and playing diatonically, which means the notes of the scale. Until this time had not been possible. It had all been just high with the chops. And so the beginning of this concerto, the audience were quite restless. It'd been marketed as something you've never heard this before. It's completely different from everything else that's ever been written. But of course it wasn't. It started with a fanfare. So of course the audience were thinking, this is not different. But of course, when the theme itself comes in just a few bars later, it really was very different. And every time we play this concerto, we have to remember the trumpet will have never been heard like this before. So these notes, these low, soft, quiet notes had never been played on the trumpet before, and this dialogue with the orchestra, where it was a question and answer, and the orchestra came in powerfully and interrupting the trumpet, and the trumpet would answer in this quite conversational way. This was new and exciting. Everything else about this concerto I love, and every time I play it, it feels like a new discovery and a new experience, depending on the acoustic, the orchestra, the conductor, my own interpretation, things that have happened in my life and what I can bring to the piece. It's just the most perfectly formed piece. And then what happened after this, just 8 years later, Hummel composed his trumpet concerto. Now he developed many of Haydn's ideas and took them to the next level. The piece was longer, the piece was more technically complex, and even more distant keys in the middle movement. And although the trumpet concerto by Mozart has been lost, very sadly, Hummel wasn't embarrassed to borrow from his piano concerto number 21 for the middle movement of his concerto. this concerto really did explore those keys that the trumpet had never played before. And in the final movement, again, he copied the structure that Haydn had put together in his concerto, but took it to even more virtuosic lengths. Now we hear the trumpet being used in a more romantic style. After the excellent repertoire additions Weidinger made possible with his keyed trumpet, this instrument never really took off. It wasn't quite like this one, not as sophisticated as this piccolo, and it didn't really work as well as it might have done. But soon after, the piston valves were invented. These are piston valves on these two, and it was a huge step for the trumpet. It was finally able to play chromatically and much more technically difficult music. In France, over the next century, the trumpet became elevated to the status that the rest of the wind section had in terms of soloistic flair, and the music that was written, especially in 20th century Paris, and particularly at the Paris Conservatoire, was really something quite striking. It was a real melting pot for great new trumpet writing. With this in mind, the concerto by Henri Tomasi is one of my favourites of the mid-20th century. So Tomasi's concerto, written in 1948, it's very colourful, it's very quirky, it's quite schizophrenic in its personality. It starts with a huge flourish and fanfare, really very challenging technically, but musically it's so gripping, and immediately it backs off and does something a bit more subtle and a bit more introverted, and this happens throughout the piece. It's not really a piece about rhythm, it's a piece about harmony and colour and different effects. When I play this concerto and explore this concerto again, I really have to think differently, put a different hat on if you like, about vibrato. I think the different periods of music and the different styles the composers were writing in at the time really demand different things from the use of vibrato. I think vibrato has to be something like seasoning, like salt and pepper that you add or you take away. You mustn't sort of use it as a sort of standard tomato ketchup on everything. But I do think Tomasi can really take a lot of vibrato and a lot of expression in that sort of variety in the sound. I find this concerto also quite flute-like, and in the second movement I think it's very rhapsodic and very beautiful. The thing I think about a lot in this concerto is the phrasing, the colour, and also the vibrato. I'm now going to talk about a piece written by the 93-year-old Scottish composer Thea Musgrave. I think we would describe her as the jewel in the crown of our contemporary classical industry and in the contemporary classical world. She wrote a trumpet concerto for me, and I performed it a few months ago, and it's so sophisticated with its colour and its orchestration and the use of the orchestra. She's so clever, and she studied with Boulanger, she studied alongside Copland. She's had the most incredible life. She in fact based this concerto on a series of paintings by the wonderful Scottish painter Victoria Crowe, and this fourth movement of her trumpet concerto is it's a traditional Scottish tune, but it also has a beautiful underscore from the orchestra which is incredibly unexpected and quite dark, and not what you'd expect to hear with a Scottish tune. I love this concerto by Thea Musgrave. That was a traditional Scottish tune, the Bonnie Earl of Moray, but the fourth movement of the Trumpet Concerto was named after a painting by Victoria Crowe, The White Nights of a Northern Summer. Gorgeous music, so complex, original, and really she's creating a new sonic landscape for our times.